That's okay. Okay. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Matt Murray, and I'm going to be giving a talk today on Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse 5. We'll be taking a look at metaphors, as you can tell. The title of the talk was originally Coping with Alien Metaphors, but the more I dug into it, the things that I found fascinating as far as this time through the novel were the ways in which Billy Pilgrim, the main character, not only becomes unstuck in time, but really what I'm going to argue is that in the end he actually becomes unstuck in metaphor, and that's the beauty of what happens to him, and maybe the power behind whatever gospel he may have that he's trying to disseminate via radio, television, whoever he can get to listen to him. So as we know, Billy Pilgrim is struggling in the novel he's struggling to come to grips with his experience of life, his lived experience, and a lot of the way that we do that is, of course, via metaphors often. But of course, struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, one of the things that he is facing as a lived experience is being unstuck in time, as the book describes it. And so we're going to go through some ideas connected with that and see maybe what that means on a deeper level, hopefully, in the next few minutes. So as we know, of course, metaphor, really the basis of metaphor is comparison. And so when we think about Billy coming unstuck in metaphor, we're talking about the metaphoric concepts that are underlying our idea, for example, of time. So when we think about metaphors, we know that they're built on comparisons. We understand one thing in terms of another, right? We could say life is a beach, and we have some sort of an understanding of that, but we only do if we know what a beach is. And I know that you folks probably know what beaches are because you live in an area where there are beautiful beaches. The last 10 years I was in Southern California, so when I think of beaches, I think of dirty diapers, hypodermic needles, things like that. But we have better situations up here, so it's a better metaphor maybe in Northern California. But we also have other metaphors that we could use. But life is a beach. You're familiar with this probably with the Corona beer ads that are all over the place, right? Where suddenly all you have to do is pop open a Corona and you're suddenly on the beach, right? Everything is wonderful. Everything is nice. We know that's not always true. And this is, of course, expressing a philosophy of life. And there's another philosophy that's very similar. Life is a bitch, right? And so you've got a whole other set of things that we think of with this half of the equation, right? Now, again, we know that it's not a literal thing. We know that we're not talking about a literal female dog or a mean-spirited woman. We're talking about something else, right? We're talking about life being a tough proposition or life being difficult at times, right? So let's see. So those are metaphors, right? When we think about life as a beach or life as a bitch, those are metaphoric comparisons. We see these kinds of things all the time. But there's something else that we don't notice quite as often, and that's our metaphoric concepts or conceptual metaphors that are basically grounding our understanding of reality. And these are the metaphors that I feel like are important for us to explore when we think about what's happening to Billy throughout the course of the novel. So conceptual metaphors are metaphors that are underlying our experience of the world. And I've got some information that I'm going to share with you for a few minutes from a wonderful book called Metaphors We Live By. And I would encourage you to check it out if you haven't. It's a wonderful book exploring the metaphors that are important to us in life and that, in fact, do very much, they define our everyday realities in many ways. They help us to understand our experience of life. And so our conceptual system that's made up of these metaphors, of course, is something that we really don't think of on a regular basis. We're not required to do that. So let's think about some examples so that we can bring this to the forefront. And again, some of the examples I'm going to bring up are from the book Metaphors We Live By. One of the main examples that they use throughout the book is the metaphoric concept, argument is war, right? And so the concept, argument, is being understood with a certain conceptual metaphor. Argument is war, meaning that we understand the idea of argument in the same kinds of ways that we understand the concept or the idea of war. And we use a lot of the same terminology, and that's what's pointed out here, right? We not only think about, or we not only describe argument as war, but we actually use war-like terminology to describe our arguments, right? You can say your claims are indefensible. He attacked every weak point in my argument. His criticisms were right on target. I demolished his argument. I've never won an argument with him. You disagree? Okay, shoot. If you use that strategy, he'll wipe you out. He shot down all of my arguments. So we can see how a lot of the terminology we use for war often applies to the same kinds of things that we think about with argument. And we don't just describe argument in that way. It's how we experience arguments. You actually win or lose an argument. And we get those concepts from that related category, war, right? So as an example of thinking about how hard it is to get outside of our maybe culturally inherited metaphoric concepts, I'd ask you to consider, what would metaphor be like if we described it instead of war? What if metaphor is dance, or not metaphor, argument is dance? Can we even imagine what argument would be like if we described it in terms of dance? It's more of a partnership, right? Something that evolves together. I don't know where we could take that. There's a lot of different directions you could go with that. But you can see how even just a small shift like that, we have to suddenly rearrange the way we think about argument, right? Argument is not necessarily now something that's antagonistic. It's something that's maybe an interplay between two people, right? Another example that I could give you about how our lives are full of these kinds of metaphoric concepts relates to my own personal life. Oops, sorry about that. I don't consider myself necessarily a religious person, but I did grow up in a religious household. And so, of course, my parents were concerned with setting me up with metaphoric concepts. They didn't know what they were doing, of course, but they were trying to set me up with some ideas that would be the foundation of my understanding, for example, of a difficult concept to grasp, the concept that we call, or that some people call God, right? So you can think about, how would you explain the concept God to a child? Right? You can imagine that it's going to be a difficult thing to do, right? Because, of course, in the first place, children have very limited range of experience, and the concept God is almost impossible probably for any of us as adults to understand in and of itself, right? So we think about the concept of God. My parents, I asked them about it, and they don't have a recollection of this, but a couple of years ago, I went through a box of toys that my parents had set aside for me. It's toys and books from my childhood. And so I went through that box, and I discovered a book that I didn't remember from my childhood, but it was really intriguing to me. It was a book called What is God Like? And it was clearly written for a little kid. I mean, it was written, in the kind of Dr. Seuss poem kind of approach, that sort of language. But each page in the book was a metaphoric comparison, right, to help a child to understand God. Because how is a child going to understand God but to connect it with something else that they already know about in the world, right? So some of the examples, I wrote down a few here for us to check out. What is God like? So we have a concept, God. What is our conceptual metaphor going to be? God is what? Well, these are actually, of course, we might say more specifically similes, since we have like in there. But a simile is just really a modified metaphor, you might say, on a certain level, right? So God is like Dad. And I think the way the poem was going, that because Dad is big, right, and can do big things, he's strong. Mom, God is like Mom, because Mom listens to you. And, of course, on a certain level, we could say your mom maybe had a part in creating you, but the poem goes on to talk about God being your ultimate creator from the Christian point of view, of course. The brother, God is like a brother. It said maybe like a brother is busy, or I think more importantly that the little kid could understand a brother maybe that shares or that is giving, to a sibling. God is like grandmother, in the sense that grandmothers have maybe a special sort of unconditional love for their grandchildren. I don't know how food got connected with this, but I'm sure I have a lot of great food memories with my grandmothers, so maybe that's part of it. My grandmother used to make some wonderful turtle pancakes that I'll tell you about later on if you're curious. Also, God is like a doctor. because a doctor heals us, and the doctor knows us on a physiological level, on a level of our physical being, whereas God might know us maybe in a deeper way, but at least God knows our being, our totality in a way, at least again from the Christian point of view. The scariest one in my estimation in the book was the last one that I wrote down here, that I included, was policeman, right? God is like a policeman because, well, policemen protect us, right? That's not always the associated idea we have with police officers, but many times it is, and at least in the best possible world, I guess that's what it would be. So what is God like? This is the last stanza of that book, the poem that was the main meat of that book. What is God like? I'm learning every day. How do we learn this stuff? Where do we get these ideas? We learn them from the people that we know. We learn them from places we go, right? It sounds very Dr. Seuss, right? But everything that we learn about life comes from other people, right? It comes from the places that we visit. And so what kept coming to my mind again and again when thinking about metaphors is that in a way, Billy embraces the Trophimodorian or alien concept of time, but in a way all metaphors are alien metaphors, right? Because we take them from others. We take them from our experience that's outside of us. And so there's a way in which maybe all metaphors are at least partially alien in nature. So as I was saying, as children, we inherit these metaphors from our parents, from our teachers, from the people around us. But one of the great things is, as an adult, you have an opportunity, right, to maybe to acknowledge the metaphors that are an important part of your life, the concepts that are an important aspect of your being, your experience of life. But you also have the opportunity to assess those metaphoric concepts. And you have the opportunity to maybe, as we saw with Billy, to change out some metaphoric concepts if you find that the concepts that you've been working with don't really fit your life experience, right? They don't help you. They're not beneficial to your life experience. So thinking about that idea, if it is possible to shift our metaphors, to shift our conceptual metaphors, I guess we could ask, first of all, how that might benefit us. And one of the things that came to my mind as I was thinking about that question was, I don't know how many of you maybe have heard the TED Talk by Jill Bolte Taylor, My Stroke of Insight. Have any of you checked that one out? Anybody? Nobody? Okay, a few of you have. If you haven't, I highly recommend it. In fact, the book that the talk is based on is also called My Stroke of Insight, and it's an excellent book if you haven't checked it out. And one of the things you can even tell from the title, My Stroke of Insight, she's using stroke in a way that we don't normally think of, right? She was diagnosed as having a stroke, and in fact, because of the ways that we define stroke, because of the ways that her doctors understood her condition as a stroke victim, so to speak, they were less willing to do anything for her because they felt like there was nothing that could be done for her, right? And so it was very difficult for her to get any sort of treatment, any sort of even goodwill from the caregivers around her. And she had to really push hard for that. There's another really great exploration of the ways in which metaphors are a part of our understanding of illness. And it's a great book by Susan Sontag. It's actually a collection of two of her books. The first one is called Illness as Metaphor, and the second one, which I think is even more interesting, is the volume called AIDS and Its Metaphors. And it's a wonderful book. Again, they've published both of them now together, so you can get two for the price of one if you want to check this one out. But Susan Sontag wrote the first one when she was herself diagnosed with cancer. And the thing that she kept running up against is that the ways that people defined cancer and defined cancer victims made it almost impossible to get any sort of meaningful help. And it also, of course, it has a lot to do with the kinds of treatment that we even think are possible for people in these situations. So shifting our metaphors and the way that we understand, the way we define disease is not only going to affect our own conceptual understanding of it, but it has impact on our actions, right? How we respond to the people that have these diseases, how we respond to providing treatment, therapies for people with these sorts of diseases. And in fact, Susan Sontag was pointing out that most of the metaphors connected with illness basically could be described, they often focus on describing the body, and they describe the body either as a factory. So, of course, a body that's not working properly is a factory that's maybe in disrepair, or the body as a fortress, right? Where you're under attack. A lot of military metaphors connected with that. And of course, it's not too difficult to see how we use military metaphors when we think about disease and fighting disease. And of course, disease is attacking us and things like that, right? So I guess we could say in the end that our conceptual metaphors can help us. They can aid us in understanding our experience of life and dealing with life, or they can sometimes even hinder us in our experience of life, our understanding of life. Maybe there's some options even for some ways in which metaphors can be neutral. But let's start to look at maybe some specific metaphors of time here so that we can, again, provide some more examples. When we think about time from our point of view, there's a couple of different ways that we could do that, right? We could talk about time as a moving object. The time will come when. The time has long since gone when. Or the time for action has arrived. So we can see then that time is a moving object that often, in fact, is coming towards us, right? We think about it that way. Another metaphor for time. Time is stationary, so time is not moving in this metaphor, and we move through time, right? So as we go through the years, as we go further into the 2000s, we're approaching the end of the year. All of these statements include in them the idea that time is stationary and that we're moving through it. And in fact, we can see that one of the metaphors from Slaughterhouse 5 then that we run into in the first, I think it's in the first chapter, right, when the narrator is describing his attempts to write the novel, his great Dresden novel. He makes that wallpaper timeline that with his daughter's Crayolas, right? So thinking then about the metaphors that we run into in Slaughterhouse 5 that relate to time, we've got that, the narrator's wallpaper timeline, and so that fits with our idea of time as a stationary object, perhaps, that we move through. We've got the string of beads metaphor that's used, where time is a series of connected units that we experience sequentially. And there's even one that I noticed as I was rereading this last week, time is a fruit, right? At one point, I think Billy's daughter, Barbara, is asking, why didn't you do this? And he said, well, I didn't, she says, why are you just now, talking about all this time travel and all this business? And he said, well, I didn't think the time was ripe yet, but now the time is ripe. So we've also got another set of metaphors connected with time. We've got the Tropomedorian perspective on time. One of those is that he talks about Tropomedorians being able to see in 4 dimensions, and that's I'm not exactly sure how we could deal with that. The closest we get, of course, is that we actually do have a realm of physics that thinks about time as being the 4th dimension, and so that's connected with space-time theories, and so we do have theoretical physicists that use this type of concept all the time in their work. We also have the idea of the insect that is locked inside an amber block, right? That time is an object, then the moment is structured. We see that, that phrase coming up again and again in the novel. The moment was structured this way, or the moment was orchestrated in such a way. And the most interesting one, of course, is, or the most fully developed metaphor from the Tropomedorian perspective is the metaphor that develops from the mountain range. So I'm going to just read that passage because I think it's worth doing. And if you have your books, if you want to read along, of course you can. This is starts on page 146, about the middle of the page there. There was a lot that Billy said that was gibberish to the Tropomedorians. I guess I should back up. This is when Billy is in the zoo, right? And he is being put on display. And so, of course, as we know with most zoo-type exhibits, the idea is to try to understand that creature and its world, right? And so the Tropomedorians are trying to understand Earthlings, trying to understand Billy as an example of Earthlings. And one of the things, of course, that is a striking difference between their culture and our culture is their understanding of time. And in fact, they have it's almost impossible for them to understand time from an Earthling point of view. And so these are this is an attempt to explain Earth time to other Tropomedorians. There was a lot that Billy said that was gibberish to the Tropomedorians too. They couldn't imagine what time looked like to him. Billy had given up on explaining that. The guide outside had to explain as best he could. The guide invited the crowd to imagine that they were looking across a desert at a mountain range on a day that was twinkling bright and clear. They could look at a peak or a bird or a cloud at a stone right in front of them, or even down into a canyon behind them. But among them was this poor earthling, and his head was encased in a steel sphere which he could never take off. There was only one eye hole through which he could look, and welded to that eye hole were 6 feet of pipe. This was only the beginning of Billy's miseries in the metaphor. He was also strapped to a steel lattice, which was bolted to a flat car on rails, and there was no way he could turn his head or touch the pipe. The far end of the pipe rested on a bipod, which was also bolted to the flat car. All Billy could see was the little dot at the end of the pipe. He didn't know he was on a flat car. He didn't even know there was anything peculiar about his situation. The flat car sometimes crept, sometimes went extremely fast, often stopped, went uphill, downhill, around curves, along straightaways. Whatever poor Billy saw through the pipe, he had no choice but to say to himself, "That's life." Right? And so, as they try to explain to another, or as Tropomedorians try to understand Earth time, the difference that we're beginning to see is that we, as Earthlings, when we experience time, no matter how much we worry about the future and no matter how much we worry about the past, we still are stuck in a moment, right? We're all here right now listening to this lecture, even though you may wish you were somewhere else eating a hamburger or whatever, right? We're here right now, and there's nothing. Well, you can't get up if you'd like, but maybe we can wait a few more minutes. But from the Tropomedorian perspective, they can see everything. They can see the totality of time. And what's interesting about that, at least the implications for their lived experience, is that they can choose what they want to look at. They can choose what part of life that they want to view. And what that means for them, at least, is if you want to have a happy life, pay attention to the happy stuff. Focus on the things that were beautiful, the things that were wonderful, right? And, of course, they admit that there are terrible atrocities that happen in their world, but they just choose to zoom through those times, or remember also that, for example, however tragic it is that someone might die, there's also another moment crystallized in amber where that person is living, right? And so what need is there to be sad, right? Both of those moments exist. There's life and there's death. That may not be a consolation to us as Earthlings, but it maybe begins to get there. And of course, Billy, one of the things that's troubling for Billy is that he is not stuck in time in the same way that we are. Because of his experiences in the war, we know that he actually is shifting back and forth in time. In fact, there's several descriptions of time that are connected to that. He's described as being spastic in time, which maybe, of course, we would think of as being out of control. He's also unstuck in time in the sense that maybe he's ungrounded and that he's not, situated in one place. Of course, I guess that would be another conceptual metaphor underneath a conceptual metaphor. We also have the metaphor of Billy's experience being life being like a pendulum that swings, or time being a pendulum that swings in and out of life. And so his experiences, can be described by that arc as the pendulum swings into death, and it swings back all the way to his birth. And it tells us, or the narrator tells us in the novel, that Billy has experienced his birth and death many times. That, in fact, at one point, his wife says, "I want to lose some weight for you," or whatever. She's trying to be, whatever she thinks a good wife is for him. But he's not worried about it. Why is that? Because he's traveled through their whole life together many times, being unstuck in time. And he knows that for the most part, their life together is going to be a very wonderful, pleasant experience. So he doesn't have any fears about what she may do or what she may not do in order to try to be a better wife, because he knows the past, he knows the future. There's nothing really for him to worry about. But of course, a psychologist would have another definition of Billy's experience. They would say that perhaps he was having flashbacks, one of the major symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder. But in the end, I'm not sure that definition is going to be very helpful to Billy, right? Because you can label it, you can call it something, but is that going to help him to make his way through life any more easily? It may, but it may not. And what turns out to be, I guess, more helpful for Billy is this attempt to embrace the Trophmodorian concept of time. And in fact, once Billy starts to understand that, it seems like a lot of his anxieties about his flashbacks and flash forwards start to drop away, right? He's not so concerned about it anymore. And it even seems that there's a point at which he starts to be able to shift in time under his own volition. At least once or twice, it seems like in the novel, it seemed like there was an uncomfortable moment arriving, and so he decided to shift in time to another moment in order to avoid that uncomfortable experience. At one point in the novel, Billy goes to the city and he's trying to find a TV station or a radio program or somebody that'll get his ideas out there, right? He's got a burning desire inside to share this new information about time. He feels like if other earthlings can just understand this idea of time, that maybe a lot of things could be avoided. And he's still stuck in this idea, maybe even, I don't know, perhaps that things could be better in some way, but the Trophmodorians don't necessarily see it that way, right? Things just are. They are what they are. This is the moment, and it's structured this way. There's nothing you can do about it. But Billy feels like that maybe there's something that we can do. There's something we can change, and that's our metaphors, right? Our concepts that are behind our understanding of our experience in life. So when we think about Billy's experience, once he embraces this, he's got a new way of understanding his flashbacks. He's not as concerned about it anymore. He's got a desire to share these new ideas with people. And the idea, of course, is good change will come from that. And I guess the question for us then, as readers of the novel, or at least one question that comes to my mind is, okay, well, what about for us, right? Most of us, of course, I don't know very many of you in this room, but I haven't actually met anyone who has claimed to be abducted by aliens, but there are many people out there who have. Most of us will not have the opportunity to be abducted, I don't think. So without that opportunity, I wonder what we could do to unstick ourselves from our own conceptual metaphors, because I think there could be some benefit to that from time to time. Right? So we don't have alien abduction to work with. One of the first things that came to my mind, though, that would be a similar type experience is travel. Right? How many of you folks like to travel? I love traveling. It's one of the things that my wife and I are dedicated to, is traveling to various parts of the States, various parts of the world, experiencing other cultures. Even, of course, that includes often, at least partially, learning new languages. And anytime you learn a new language, of course, you learn new concepts, you learn new ideas, you learn new ways of looking at the world. It's not just a matter of conjugating verbs and learning new vocabulary. It's about the ideas, it's about the idioms, it's about the conceptual metaphors that are behind the language. So there's other opportunities, though, for us, even if you don't have the time or the money to do any great traveling. You can visit an art museum. Plenty of those around. You can enjoy work of music, work of literature, like Slaughterhouse 5, films. You could even go to a lecture. Right? So, coming back to some of that religious talk, even though I claim I'm not a religious person, it comes up in my life a lot because that's where a lot of my concepts came from when I was growing up. I remember one of the stories from the Christian tradition came to my mind when I was thinking about all these ideas with metaphors and Billy's situation. I was thinking about the parable that Jesus told that we think of as the parable of the wineskins. And the parable of the wineskins, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, there's some discussion about the followers of Jesus and whether they should be continuing the Jewish traditions that are a part of their heritage and their culture, or if they should drop those by the wayside and take on new traditions. And in some ways of understanding the parable, it seems like Jesus is saying that some of the things are going to be thrown to the wayside and some things maybe will be retained. But the idea is that you've got a wineskin, the old school way of storing wine, right? We use bottles now, so it's not as big of a deal, right? But with you have a wineskin made out of leather, right? And when you put new wine in there, what happens when wine ages? It expands, and it's going to expand that leather to the point to where if any more expansions happen, it's going to break, right? So if you try to put new wine into old wineskins, once that expansion happens, they will rupture, and you've lost all your good juice, right? So the idea is don't put new wine into old wineskins. And like I say, a lot of people see that as being a matter of, trying to maybe tear down the Jewish traditions that preceded the message of Jesus in the Christian tradition. But I think it maybe goes even deeper than that, right? That it's a matter of metaphors, right? That he's saying perhaps that from time to time as human beings, we need to remember that metaphors don't last forever, right? That maybe there are times when we need to seek out new metaphors, novel metaphors, or new ways of understanding our old metaphors because our experiences of life change. And as we evolve as human beings, certainly our metaphors and our concepts behind those metaphors should hopefully change as well. And so I was thinking, how can we connect that to what Billy's up to here with his burning desire to spread his new gospel? He's trying to get us to see that if we can maybe unthink or unstick ourselves from some of these metaphors, some of the things that we experience in life might not be quite so troubling, right? Even something as crazy as being out of control with flashbacks, right? Maybe there's a way to understand that where it doesn't, mean that you are a broken machine, a broken factory, or a fortress under attack. Right? That there may be other metaphors that we could use to understand that experience that might actually be not only beneficial for us as we try to deal with people that we know who are suffering these kinds of things, but also for those very people themselves as they try to understand their own experience of life. So I guess I'll end with one other quote here from the book that connects with all this idea about new metaphors, perhaps. This is from Elliot Rosewater, one of Billy's roommates at the VA hospital, right? This is what Elliot was saying to a psychiatrist at one point. I think you guys are going to have to come up with a lot of wonderful new lies, or people just aren't going to want to go on living. And I guess maybe we could connect that with the Picasso idea, right? That art is a lie that helps you to see the truth. Right? When we think beyond categories like that of truth and lies, what we really have are metaphors, right? The different metaphors that we use to describe our experience. So what Rosewater is really saying is you guys are going to have to come up with some new concepts, or people aren't going to, we're going to run out of the energy and the desire to keep living under these same ways of understanding our experience. I guess that's my talk. That's Billy's gospel. I hope you're edified, and if you want to come down and be prayed over at the end of the service, you're welcome to do that. So we've got plenty of time for some questions, if there are any. Yes? Turtle pancakes. Yeah, well, they're not made out of turtles, I'll tell you that much. That does sound more interesting maybe, but it's just one of those things where grandmas are really adept at making pancakes in special shapes, right? And so she would make it look like the overhead look at a turtle. Got a question?
Is there any toys in the box that had a major impact on your life? Other than the book, were there any toys or anything else substantial in that box?
Well, I can't think of anything in particular that I remember from that box. The only other things in the box that had that book that I remember, the question was, were there any other items in the box that caused me to reflect in this same kind of way? The only other items that I really kept out of the box were my Star Wars action figures from the late 70s. But I have to say that my beagle just chewed the head off of Yoda a couple of weeks ago, so I'm very sad about that. Other questions? No, thanks everyone for being here. Don't forget that there's going to be a lecture tomorrow evening. Michael Krasny will be here at 5:30. and we would love for you to be here. Oh, we have one more question here.
So, on the characteristics on metaphors, are those characteristics tangent or are they concrete between metaphors?
What do you
So if a metaphor is being used for, say, all cars are very fast and people run quickly as well, talking about different types of speed and different comparisons, we have to continue to use that comparison in their characteristic of speed. So you can't say all cars are fast and people run quickly too. You can't just say dogs run quickly and so do cars. Or, sorry, dogs run quickly and so do trees.
Sure. Well, probably I'd have to investigate it, explore it a little bit, but we may even be talking about two underlying conceptual metaphors instead of just one. It may be that we have two ideas about running that we use in different contexts, right? Like the kind of running that we think of as humans or dogs or animals doing versus machines, right?
So if I was going to use the metaphor, beaches are very calm and life is a beach, I would say bitches are very calm and life is bitch.
Yeah, of course we know that crossing metaphors like that will get you into trouble with your teachers, but also with your own life experience even sometimes. But yeah, there's some ways that all metaphor comparisons are partial. That's one thing we have to remember. It's never going to be 100% connection, right? So some things may apply, some things may not, depending upon the context. Okay? Other questions? Got plenty of time. I might be able to explain the mysteries of life. I guess not. Okay. Oh, yes, one more.
I'm not really sure what I'm asking, but why is it important for the common person to be unstuck his time? Just to be able to heal and to interpret the world in a different way compared to old interpretations of life?
Well, okay, so the question is, why would it be important for us as humans, as any average everyday person, to become unstuck in time? I'm not sure that it is important for us to do that. And that's why I ended up changing one of the titles, at least in my talk, to How to Become Unstuck in Metaphor, right? Instead of being unstuck in time. Because time is just one of many conceptual metaphors that are a part of our lived experience. It may be important for some of us to bust out of that idea of time. I think when it becomes important is when we start to realize that our metaphors aren't serving us well, right? When they're actually maybe causing us more problems than they're helping, right? And so it's possible that we would have different needs, each individual one of us, in attempting to become unstuck in various metaphors that are a part of our experience. Because none of us have the same conceptual metaphors 100% exact across the board, even though we get a lot of those from our culture in general. So.
Are there poets and authors right now or any artists in general that you feel are sort of creating a metaphor that would be helpful as far as breaking out of old metaphors?
I would say that that's a characteristic of the best art and the best literature of all time, any time. What's going on now, what's going on in the past. As far as any particular names, it would be hard to say. I think part of it depends on your personal proclivities as a reader, what you're into. I know a favorite author of mine is Tom Robbins, and I love him for many of the same reasons I love Kurt Vonnegut, and I love him even more because often when I walk away from a Tom Robbins novel, I'm usually a little bit less bummed out and depressed than I am when I walk away from a Kurt Vonnegut novel. So that's the main difference for me anyways. So. Yes?
You spoke a lot about time and time metaphors. Could you speak a little bit about place and the sense of place? Because everything about Slaughterhouse 5 really takes place in Dresden, Germany.
Right.
During World War II. Could you speak a little bit about that?
I don't know. I could if I was... What's that? Okay. It sounds like that's, in fact, exactly what our talk on Monday is going to cover. In fact, yes, that's right. Mark Bojanowski is going to be giving a talk on Monday at noon on the concept of setting in Slaughterhouse 5. So that one will certainly, I'll let him step up to the plate for that one. Okay. Yes?
A couple things. Number one, I really like that you pointed out that our conceptual metaphors are typically portrayed in a negative way in terms of, your first example was
Sure.
Use of proper context.
Sure.
Argument.
But we don't always, not all of us have that concept about argument. One of the things Eric is pointing out is that, some of us don't think about argument in negative terms. In fact, a lot of us English teachers, of course, we make our living by teaching people how to argue, right? So, for example, I can tell you that I grew up, as I was mentioning before, in a very, very conservative Christian household. And one of the ramifications of that is that I never in my entire life saw my parents have an argument. Never saw it. My experience as a married man is that arguments happen all the time, right? So I don't know. But so when I did see arguments as a child, they were disturbing to me. Right? And so as I was growing up, I found that I was avoiding arguments as much as possible in my life, and I would do various crazy, insane strategies to try to avoid any kind of argument in any, context. And that in and of itself is crazy, right? Because you're right. Well, maybe it's only crazy from another metaphoric point of view. There are a lot of different ways that we can think about argument, and the more I explore the concept argument is dance, I'm fascinated and intrigued by that metaphor. And part of the reason I like to compare those two concepts is that they're so vastly different, right? And we're so stuck in the idea of argument as war that it's almost impossible for us to think about it as being in any other kind of way. Even if we like argument, we still use that same terminology, right? In fact, I know people, one of my best friends in Southern California, he argues more than anyone I've ever seen, right? He always, anytime you get in a conversation with him, it's going to turn into an argument. And so I asked him one day, I said, look, Dave, it seems like to me you don't even care what point you're arguing. He said, you're exactly right. I don't care what point I'm arguing. I just like to get into arguments. And so whatever this person is arguing, I'm going to take the other position, right? And that seems crazy on a certain level, but he's also a very interesting person to hang out with, and we end up having a lot of interesting conversations because of that. So, that approach to life isn't always a bad thing. Sure.
Their concept of time, it seems to me that although they talk about life and death, it seems that there is no finality.
Right.
So how does that, it seems to contradict itself.
Well, finality, again, is connected with our metaphors, right? And so if we think about time as an object that we move through, when we think about it orientation-wise in our culture, we might set it up as the beginning is at the left and the end is at the right. And so when we think about beginnings and ends, we think about it in terms of that kind of a continuum, right? But when you think about maybe other cultural metaphors for time that are more like loops and loops of loops or whatever, then there's not those same kinds of concerns about beginnings and endings that we have because it's not a final situation, And even if we think about the Tralfamadorian perspective, it's just a range of things, and there's no beginning and no end. It's just there's this field of perception there. Right?
Do you have a certain metaphor that's resurfaced a lot in your life, or that you use as a mantra, or something you find
Well, I don't know about that, but I will say that a few weeks ago I was trying to figure out if there could be such a thing as a Taoist metaphor. And so what I came up with, and a friend helped me with this, this is what we came up with. Everything is everything else, but nothing is anything else. I don't know if it works or not. What time?
No, just repeat the question.
Repeating the question, okay. So the question there, I don't even remember after I've answered it now. Okay, do I have certain metaphors that come up again and again in my life? And of course, that's why I bring up some of the experiences like that book, What is God Like? Because like I say, I'm not necessarily a religious person, but because that's a part of my experience, it's a part of the things that that went into creating my understanding of the world. I have to account for those things, and I have to well, at least I feel like it's important for me to do some sort of an analysis of those to make sure that they are serving me well in my life. Great.
Matt, I wish that Obama and Romney were here. And instead of listening to their sort of
detailed differences, that they could speak in terms of conceptual metaphors. And then the electorate would know that they really are truly choosing between two different understandings of life.
Sure. Sure. Yeah, I think there are a lot of ways that we could get more out of those situations than we typically get, right? That those really seem to be non-helpful scenarios for the most part. But you're right. I mean, I think that, again, in the same way that the best art and the best literature challenges our conceptual metaphors, I think for someone to be a true leader, that's part of what's going to be involved with that. And I think that's part of what we see not happening with our leadership in general in our country, it seems right now, is that maybe they're not even aware of their own conceptual metaphors that they're dealing with, but they're not dealing with things at that level. They're just, it seems like every 4 years or so, they just whip up the hatred so we all hate each other and forget about that we're not really the enemies of each other, right? We're in this together, right? So, other questions? All right, well, I thank you once again for being here, for your patience, and if you have any other questions, please feel free to stop by.